day all the way around on Wednesday when I got to be honest with you, I walked into the Ravens Liars Luncheon, and I'm not expecting news to be broken there, Luke, but when Ozzie said we've signed Robert Griffin, I had to think about who the hell Robert Griffin was. Like, it literally took me 15 seconds to say, oh, he means the quarterback, the one in Washington. Oh, that guy. I forgot he was still around. So Wednesday was a little, a little more going on than usual for an April around here in the Charm City, right?
It is funny because I had the same reaction. When he said Robert Griffin, I'm like, Robert Griffin.
Is he a safety or a cornerback?
No, you have to say RG3, or you at least need to get the third in there.
I'm glad I'm not the only one because I looked and I'm like, who the hell's Robert Griffin? Oh, that guy. It didn't. And I know we've been talking about backup quarterbacks for like 4 months, right? Literally, because Ryan Mallett clearly was not going to be Nick Foles around here.
Yeah, I think that much is true. But at the same time, let's be fair. Robert Griffin III wasn't even in the NFL last year. So I think the reaction that you had, that I had, and a number of people on Twitter, and it took me about 2 seconds, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's who he's talking about.
Yeah, I know who Colin Kaepernick is, but I don't know who Robert Griffin is. Right?
Yeah, I think if he had announced they were signing Colin Kaepernick, that probably would have been a little bit of a bigger headline than Robert Griffin III. But
Colin Kaepernick almost won the Super Bowl once. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, I remember something about that. I think he was playing a team in purple, actually. But, I mean, I'd be lying to you if, and I tried to formulate an opinion on Robert Griffin III for hours on Wednesday.
So did I, by the way. Everybody was asking my opinion, and I didn't have one.
I'd be lying to you if I said I had a strong one. The one thing I will say is when you're talking about a guy who has been as oft injured as him over the last several years, and we all remember back to his rookie year and how that was kind of a magical season for him. Remember, played well against the Ravens, hurt his knee late in that game, but he had such a tremendous rookie year. We saw how that ended for him in hurting his knee. But everything since then has just been so downhill for him. I'm not saying I hate this move because this guy at best to me is going to be their backup quarterback. I think the notion that some people have thrown out there that this is going to pressure or push Joe Flacco, I think that's laughable.
Those are just people that don't watch football. I mean, and there's a lot of that goes around in this town. After anything that happens, there's just it's like politics. There's absurdity, you know, in people's opinions. And I, 23 years into it, if you think RG3 is coming to take Joe Flacco's job, you're just not a very good football fan.
I mean, to me, if you want to do something to get Joe Flacco's attention, if you want to do something to push him, that's when you take a quarterback in the third or fourth round that has some real upside. Now, that doesn't mean that quarterback is going to unseat him this year, but we know we're talking long-term here. We're talking 2 or 3 years down the road here with a third or fourth round quarterback, and Eric DeCosta talked about this on Wednesday, he didn't name names, but he said he thinks there are 8 to 9 quarterbacks in this draft class who have the potential to become a starter at some point during their rookie contract. Now, we're talking about a 4-year period there. I think doing that gets Joe Flacco's attention much more than bringing in Robert Griffin III. I think Griffin is far more likely to be the next Curtis Painter than Trent Dilfer, if that makes sense. Remember, Painter they brought in, I think it was 2012. He had started 8 or 9 games for Indy the year before. That was the famed suck for luck year in Indianapolis with Peyton Manning.
I forgot about suck for luck. It's been a little while since we've talked about that season.
Yeah. And Curtis Painter, I think he signed right around this time. I want to say it might have been mid-April. It was right before the draft. And people were talking about him in the context of not pushing Flacco, of course, but they were saying, they're going to upgrade from Tyrod Taylor as their backup quarterback, and Curtis Painter never made the football team. So I think Griffin, certainly he'll be in the mix to be the backup. If the draft board doesn't set up for the Ravens to take a quarterback in, say, the first 3 or 4 rounds, then he might be their backup quarterback. But this idea that he's going to put any kind of real pressure on Flacco. I mean, you mentioned Ryan Mallett, and look, I wasn't exactly flying the flag to bring Ryan Mallett back, but I'm not convinced Robert Griffin III at this point in his career is markedly better or even better than Ryan Mallett. So we'll see. I mean, we've already spent 2 more minutes on this than really we should on a quarterback. It's just we know on a backup quarterback, but we know what the history was. We know what this guy was in college. We know what his rookie year was like. But, I mean, he has barely played any football over the last 3 years. And when he has played, in defense to him, it was with the Cleveland Browns, but didn't look very pretty. So we'll see. I mean, again, this is a one-year deal. I assume it's for the vet minimum with maybe some incentives built in there for playing time. But, again, the idea to me, I'm fine with the idea of wanting to put a little bit of pressure on Joe Flacco, making him a little uncomfortable. I'm okay if you want to do that. Robert Griffin III is not the guy that's going to do that.
Well, there was great pedigree with him, right? And I guess that's all part of, how this story... I should call Dave Sheinin. I mean, Dave wrote a book, right? So, I'll get him on before the month's over to talk about it a little bit. But, I don't know that it affects their draft at all. Like, literally, no. It's like, we got the backup quarterback. We're not going to take that kid out of wherever in the third round. That's not what happened on Wednesday. So, all right, to baseball we go. Luke Jones, of course, you can find him. Luke at WNST. We got bigger problems. I mean, we're about the Ravens' problems in September. They can't lose till then. I'm worried about whether the Orioles are going to win between now and September as they go off to New York. And, this is going to be a real problem for you and I on the morning after these sweeps and, these pitching performances to – how do you do? I don't know. In Cleveland, we always talk to Darryl Ryder and these guys. How do you continue to discuss the Browns year after year? But with baseball, when you start to lose like this early in the year, you just want to sort of stop the bleeding, and going to New York is not the place that's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, as I noted on Twitter, and you alluded to this a few minutes ago when we started our conversation, I mean, you go from the World Series champions to the AL runner-ups. I mean, it doesn't get any easier. And look, I mean, we're still talking about 6 games into the season. I mean, every team in baseball is going to have a stretch, a 1-5 stretch at some point over the course of the season. Yes, even the Astros, even the Yankees, they'll lose 5 of 6 at some point. I mean, I would almost be willing to put some real money on that proposition. But when it happens at the beginning of the season, when you're seeing a lot of the same issues that you saw last year, specifically in the month of September, you get to a point where, all right, I mean, guys, it's 6 games into the season, but you don't want to bury yourself here. You don't want to come home 2-8. If they lose 3 out of 4 this weekend, you don't want to come home, heaven forbid, if you get swept in the Bronx over these next 4 games and you're 1-9. I mean, take a look at the Toronto Blue Jays a year ago, who were coming off back-to-back ALCS appearances. They started 1-9 and they never recovered. They played okay during stretches last year. I think they may have gotten up to 500, or I feel like they may have gotten back to 1 game below 500. So it's not as though they didn't make a push, but when you start and you're 7-8 games below 500 right off the bat, that is really tough to do. And I mean, we all point to the 1988 historic example of the Orioles starting 0-21. I mean that is such a statistical anomaly for any team to do that. But when you get off to a start and starting 1-5, this is their worst start after 6 games since 2010. That was Dave Tremblay's last year, and they brought Buck Showalter in later in the season, and they got better. But they started 2-16 that year, and it's completely over by the time tax day rolls around. I mean, was that the year Andy McPhail was in the funny little sweater and apologizing to the fans? I believe so. I remember Dave Tremblay.
They really all do run together. I mean,
sure.
You should remember every little nugget about all this awfulness over these years. But I've tended to sort of suppress that memory.
And if you recall that season, going into 2010, that was going to be Matt Wieder's first full season. Nick Markakis was into year 5 of his career. Adam Jones was into year 3 of his Orioles career. There were some notions out there. Not that the Orioles were going to contend, but there were some notions out there that maybe that was going to be the time that they got to the 500 mark and were starting to look like an ascending team. And boy, it was the exact opposite. They were horrendous that year. So it's not as though it's unprecedented for any team that has some level of expectations. And you had them in the 84-85 win territory. I had them at 82-80. I'm still not ready to completely dismiss that possibility after 6 games. I've seen way too much baseball over the course of my life. But at the same time, it's really tough to look at this thing and not be concerned. I mean,
by the way, the 2010 team, I just went back. Brad Bergeson started 28 games for them.
Well, if you remember, the year before that, he was actually really good. He was kind of a rookie sensation before, he took a line drive to the shin, I think it was. And, I mean, it was a smoke and mirrors kind of a situation. I mean, there was a guy that, a sinker baller, didn't miss many bats. But
Chris Tillman made 11 starts with an ERA of 6. Jake Arrieta made 18 starts with an ERA of 5. That was the year they kept trying Arrieta, and so they had all these young guys, and they just kept bringing. Mattis made 32 starts that year with an ERA of 5, and he was supposed to be the second coming.
Well, remember that was the cavalry. I mean that was. That was the.
Oh, I remember. They came over the hill, then they got shot up. Yeah.
Sure. So I mean, you just look at this thing, and are there some silver linings to take away from the Houston series? At least what we saw. I mean, the bats had woken up the game before, but on Wednesday afternoon they had a slew of opportunities against the Dallas Keuchel that frankly wasn't all that good. I mean, he walked 4 batters in 5 innings. To the Orioles' credit, they actually worked some counts. They actually had some decent at-bats, but then they were 0 for 8 with runners in scoring position. So they had some opportunities, unlike the first 3-4 games where they weren't doing anything whatsoever with the bats, but you still have to cash in. And Dylan Bundy pitches well again, 8 strikeouts, 2 runs, only one of them earned over 6 innings. I mean, he was really, really good again, but the problem is when he's really good and you don't win, you look to the rest of this rotation, and look, I expect Kevin Gausman to be better. I expect Andrew Kashner to maybe not duplicate what he did last year, but I think he's still going to have some stretches where he pitches well. Alex Cobb could be ready to go as soon as Monday. He pitched his sim game in Sarasota on Wednesday, went 5 innings, only gave up 1 run.
And they said 74 pitches, right? So that kind of stretches him out, and he's on turn to pitch on Monday, right?
Yeah, it seemed, they had, Buck had talked last weekend about him not going into the 14th, but it looks, and they're still going to lean on him. I don't think you're going to see them make a decision probably until Friday or Saturday on this, but it's looking like he could start against Toronto on Monday. So you're going to improve your rotation there. We'll see what they end up doing. Tillman's going to have a little bit longer of a leash, I'm sure, but I'm not sure how much longer, especially if Mike Wright goes out and gives them another, at least a competitive outing. So
yeah, we'll be discussing that on Monday. When Cobb comes in, what happens here? Because Wright might be better than Tillman at this point. He might be.
And I think at this point, I mean, I'll say this, I'd much rather hold on to Mike Wright than what I've seen from the Rule 5 guys to this point. Now, that's not to say I love Mike Wright. I mean, I've seen Mike Wright over the last couple of years, but
you also saw Nestor Torres, his neck get Penningtoned on the Grand Slam. I don't know how that kid recovers, right? I mean, it's almost like Pennington. When you give up that sort of, it becomes something that sticks to you. And I'm sure Nestor Cortez hasn't slept since that happened, right?
Well, and as we even talked about during or after the Ravens, the Liars luncheon, I mean, I was still pretty fired up about this notion of trying to carry not 1 but 2 Rule 5 pitchers in a bullpen that's already without its all-star closer, and you have a rotation that, even if it ends up showing that it's improved from a year ago, this is still a below-average rotation until they prove otherwise. I mean, and I'm not even talking about the first time through per se. Just in general, they have a hell of a lot to prove. So this notion that you're going to keep 2 of them, at least with Pedro Araujo. I'm really struggling with that pronunciation, by the way. But at least with him, he throws hard. I think there is some upside there, but I don't see it with Nestor Cortez. I mean, he looks like Vidal Nuno, who they had in their bullpen last year. I mean, just a soft tossing lefty. I mean, there's nothing special about this guy. So we'll see what happens there. But the good news is you are going to get Cobb back, whether it's Monday or whether it's next weekend. He's going to be back, and it looked pretty good in his sim game from the way it sounds. But even with Cobb, it's like you need to start getting some wins here. I mean, you don't have to go to New York and sweep the Yankees. I mean, that'd be nice, but you got to win a couple games here. I mean, you can't come home 2-8, 1-9. I mean, you're already putting yourself in such a huge hole, and we know this team has its deficiencies, and those deficiencies aren't going to go away. I mean, are they going to hit better? Yes. They're not going to hit below 200 as a team this year. They're going to improve, but at some point in time, you got to start doing it. At some point, when you start losing and losing in a dramatic way early on, it gets late pretty darn early. So, to use a Yogiism, I suppose. But
well, the question for me is how many games are they going to lose after the 5th or 6th inning, right? Like, how many games are they going to be in a tie game, a run up or a run down, and either the late bats don't come back against the other team's closers, where, a lot of these teams, that's where they've spent their money. You go see the Cleveland Indians and get into their bullpen, that's where you're going to get. And teams that have had faltered bullpens since the Kansas City era, they're getting better. So getting those big hits in the 7th and 8th and 9th innings against specialists, that's what the game is designed to shut you down after the 7th inning. But that being said, the Orioles don't have that ability right now because the Orioles bullpen, much like their defense, much like their bats, much like their rotation, doesn't feel like it did when they were capable of winning 90 games a year.
Well, you don't have Zach Britton. Everyone else slots down a spot, moves down a spot in the pecking order when you have Zach Britton in the 9th inning. And look, anyone who, even before the forearm issue last year, he was never going to duplicate what he did in 2016. But when you're talking about a 2-time All-Star, a guy who had as much success as he had for a 3-year period, and then you take that out of the equation, it becomes very difficult. I still, despite what happened on Tuesday night, I still have a lot of confidence in Michael Givens. In fact, I think he's the closer of the future for this team as it's currently constructed. I still have confidence in Brad Brock, maybe not as much in the 9th inning, but the guy has proven for several years now that he can be a shutdown setup man. Darren O'Day has looked pretty good. He looked really good in the spring, and he's looked really good in his couple outings so far this year. So I like those three, but the questions after that, look, Richard Bleier was really, really good last year, but at the same time, he did it in a fashion that's so unconventional without striking anyone out that it's really tough to project him doing that again. Now, maybe I'll be wrong on that. Miguel Castro, I like the arm, but he gives up. He walks the number 9 batter on Wednesday afternoon and gives up a stolen base because he's kind of slow to the plate and doesn't really hold the runner at first base, and then he gives up the go-ahead run. You can't do that pitching in the 7th inning. You have to be better than that. And look, you're going to have those hiccups from time to time. Don't get me wrong. I'm not expecting 0 ERAs from all these guys. But to your point, in this game, in this day and age, and this is why it's absolutely insane to have 2 Rule 5 pitchers in your bullpen, you have to have 4 or 5 guys that you really feel great about, guys that you really feel can shut things down. And 3-4 years ago, the Orioles had that. They had that long of a chain. You certainly need starting pitching that's going to get you into the 6th inning, get you into the 7th inning. You can't have 4 and 5 inning starts, and that's been part of their problem here over the first week. They haven't gotten any length from anyone other than Bundy, and you got a surprising 5 innings from Mike Wright after about a 2-week layoff for him. But other than that, it's been 4 and 5 inning starts. That's not sustainable when you're already trying to endure not having your best reliever and you have 2 Rule 5 guys. In hindsight, and I think it kind of got lost in the wash because we were so focused on this team trying to improve its starting rotation, but Zach Britton tore his Achilles, right before Christmas. It's not as though that happened the first day of spring training. Why was this team not out there trying to acquire another bullpen arm? And
they thought they had Brock, right? They thought they were just going to.
Well, no, you have Brock. I'm not talking about I'm not even specifically talking about closer. To my point I just made, you need 4 or 5 studs in your bullpen in this day and age if you want to be that team that has a chance, even though you don't have the best rotation in the world. You need to have that stud bullpen, and that change just not all that long right now. You have 3 guys that you feel really, really good about, and I'm still putting Brock in that category, whether it's the 9th, the 8th. I'm not so sure I just hand him the ball automatically as my closer, but I still have a lot of confidence in him in general, and I think he's proven that over the last 3 years. But beyond that, Castro's still more of a question mark. Richard Blyer is still more of a question mark because he's only done it 1 year. Why were you not at least in the market to try to find another Brad Brock, another, not Michael Givens, because Michael Givens is cheap and under club control, and that guy isn't easily acquired from someone else, but someone of that ilk at least.
But, man, they weren't even addressing the starting rotation in the offseason so much until the end, right?
But that's my point, and we were focused so much on that, and there was so much focus in the month of December of whether they were going to trade Machado, and you were kind of thinking, okay, well, if they do that, they go into full rebuild mode, and then, well, you're not going to be worried about spending money on your bullpen because you're rebuilding anyway, and at that point, knock yourself out with 2 Rule 5 guys in the pen. I mean, if you're not trying to win, really, and you're looking to reload, but at the same time, you sign Alex Cobb, which they deserve praise for. That made the Cashner signing look better in my eyes. But you still now have this bullpen that, even with Zach Britton supposedly being ahead of schedule, he's on the 60-day DL. He can't come off the 60-day DL until the end of May. I mean, that's the absolute earliest he's going to be ready. I'm skeptical that that's when he actually is going to be ready, but my point is, you have 2 months of baseball at the very least without your best reliever, and you didn't do anything to address the bullpen in the meantime. So that's where this was kind of overlooked because we were so focused on the state of the starting rotation. But this team really could have benefited from the addition of another bullpen arm, and instead you're kind of in this hold on mode where you're really, really hoping for better starts. And they need those anyway, by the way. Again, you can't survive with consistently 4 or 5 inning starts from everyone but Dylan Bundy. And if that's going to be what it is, well, then yeah, they are going to lose 95 games most likely. But you need some improvement there, certainly. But at the same time, with this bullpen the way it's constructed, this is why I wasn't beating up Buck Showalter individually too much for what happened on Tuesday, although he's not completely absolved. But you have 2 Rule 5 guys in your bullpen. They're going to have to pitch some innings that mean something sometimes, whether it was Tuesday night, whether it's Friday in the Bronx, whether it's against Toronto next Tuesday. That's inevitable. So you really look at this thing now, 6 games in, and you say, man, really could have benefited from another bullpen arm. And what used to be such an overwhelming strength for this team, I don't think the bullpen's terrible, but it's not really looking like that strength that it used to be relative to some of the other areas of the game.
All right, Luke Jones joining us here. It's all brought to you by our friends at Howard Bank as well as Cole Roofing. I want to remind everybody to get over to Pizza John's. I got over there on Wednesday. I actually watched the last 4 innings of the Orioles game over in Essex, over a cheesesteak that I brought home to my wife and a delicious pizza with everything on it. I did not get the meat sauce for you, Luke. That's for you to decide when you get down there this weekend. Also brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Jockey Club. They are racing at Laurel. You can find all of that on the front of WNST.net as well as inside of our WNST morning newspaper. We deliver that digitally to your email inbox each and every morning at 7 a.m. That's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast. I've got the Kona blend in my Cole Roofing mug here this morning. Delicious coffee. It's always there for you at Royal Farms, as well as the fried chicken and the Western fries. But you got to download that app. You got to be using that app when you're pumping the gas. It will save you dough. Earn those points to get yourself some free fried chicken. Luke, you talk about the bullpen not being the same, the offense not being the same, the pitching not being the same. I brought this up earlier in the week, and you almost got a little flippant with me about the defense not being what it used to be, because I look out there and I don't see Matt Wieters anymore. I don't see J.J. Hardy anymore. I see Tim Beckham at third base, where he may or may not know what he's doing. I see Chris Davis kicking the ball around the first week. And, finally it kind of came to you on Wednesday, 6 games into the year, that defense hasn't been very good this year either, along with all the other problems they've had.
Right. To be clear, I didn't disagree with your general point. I didn't think that was a major storyline from the Minnesota series. That's where I was coming from. No,
it was just an observation that in general they're going to lose runs because their defense isn't as good as it used to be.
Well, some of the names you mentioned, I'd take Caleb Joseph over Matt Wieters right now. Matt Wieters, first of all, he's on the DL.
I'm more for the legend of Matt Wieters. I'm talking about the 2012.
And what Matt Wieters was 5 years ago.
Yeah, throwing guys out from his knees. There was
a
period when Buck got here, when the team first started getting good. Yeah, Gonzalez was okay and Chen was okay and they hit home runs and all that. but they were really, really good defensively in a way that it was never the first thing you talked about, because you talked about, hey, look at that Zach Britton, or look at that, flashy Machado, or, look at Buck and how brilliant he is. You didn't say, wow, look at their defense, but behind it all, when I think of that era and then playing those games at Yankee Stadium and playing in Kansas City, the defense was a huge part of that in a way that you wouldn't talk about it, because you don't talk about defense like that in baseball.
And the 2014 team, we talked about the defense quite a bit. You mentioned Caleb Joseph's a good defensive catcher. That's not an issue. In fact, he's probably, if they keep him fresh enough and he doesn't wear down and they don't catch him 125 games, which I think would be a wildly bad decision. I think he needs to be probably in more that 100 range game, 105 games. But he's one of their better defenders, actually, I think, at this point in time. But you're right. I mean, you kind of look at it across the board. I mean, we didn't talk too much about this on Tuesday night, but that triple to deep center field, Adam Jones catches that ball a couple years ago. I mean, he just didn't run it down, and that was a pretty good case study right there, a pretty good snapshot right there of those that have said Adam Jones needs to move to a corner outfield spot. Now, right now, the Orioles don't have a better option than him in center field, so it is what it is. But across the board, I mean, Scope at second base, I'll check off on that, even though I have long-term concerns about his range at second base. Machado at shortstop, I think he's going to be good there at the very least. I'm not convinced that he's a Gold Glove shortstop in the same way that he is a third baseman, because it's a completely different animal. But the outfield defense still leaves a lot to be desired unless Craig Gentry is out there, and certainly he makes them better because he is a good defensive outfielder, but he can't swing the bat. So what value are you really getting out of that? But there are a lot of question marks, and I don't think they're necessarily going to be the worst defensive team in baseball or terrible, but you're right from a standpoint of it's definitely not a strength of theirs anymore, and really hasn't been for a couple years now. That's really been the case.
But it's whittled away. It's gone a little slowly. Yeah. I would say as a Stratomatic team, they've gone from being a solid 1 to maybe being a 3 on certain days. You know what I mean? Like that's
fair.
And they're going to lose games because of it. To your point, Adam Jones not tracking down a ball in the outfield that he used to get to, that's trouble. And Gentry went over the wall opening day. I mean, otherwise they would have lost that in regulation, right?
Yeah, I mean, they could have.
They'd be 0-6.
Well, but they also blew a 2-run lead in the ninth inning, too. I mean, I don't want to start going down that road because they deserve to win.
That goes back to the bullpen.
Yeah. So, but that said, I mean, you look at the defense. I mean, the Santander was charged with a throwing error late in that game on Wednesday that I thought it was more a case of Manny Machado needs to get over and make the catch. It wasn't that bad of a throw. I mean, it went off his glove. It kind of seemed a little lackadaisical there, which we've seen Machado do from time to time, as great as he is. So there are certainly questions there. I mean, I'm not convinced that Tim Beckham can't play a really solid third base for you, but is he going to be Manny Machado? No. Is Manny Machado going to be a good shortstop? I think so, but is he going to be J.J. Hardy from 4 or 5 years ago? I don't know. That remains to be seen. I mean, as much as we speak about him being a natural shortstop, third base is a really different animal than that. So, and from the time Machado was drafted 8 years ago, there was always a notion or at least a question of whether he was going to stick at shortstop long term because he was so big and wouldn't necessarily have the range. So you kind of just go down the list and, there are questions all over the place with that, too. I mean, I'm not as concerned about the defense as I am, say, the pitching, but it kind of goes back to the point I just made about the bullpen. These things that used to be major strengths for the Orioles don't really look like strengths anymore. They're not necessarily colossal weaknesses.
Well, half an hour into this, you're discussing every weakness they have. I don't know what their strength is.
Right.
What are they good at this point? Right?
Dylan Bundy's looked really, really good. Beyond that, I mean, I guess the good news, if you're looking for other positives, Scope's bat really came alive during the Houston series. I mean, he looked awful against Minnesota, but he looked more and more like Jonathan Scope. Had 3 hits on Wednesday. He's looking pretty good. Jones's bat has heated up. Machado's kind of still lying in the weeds. Some hasn't hit for much power yet. So they at least have a handful of guys starting to swing the bat better. But on the flip side, Chris Davis, pinch hits, strikes out. I mean, he looks absolutely awful, absolutely lost. I mean, he looks like a disaster 6 games into this thing. Colby Rasmus has looked perhaps worse than Chris Davis. In fact, Rasmus in 14 at-bats, he struck out 9 times. I mean, he looks clueless up there. The bat just looks really, really slow. So, look, again, we're dealing with small sample sizes, and that's not to say Chris Davis won't go on a tear in a couple weeks, but at some point in time, you need to start seeing some markedly better play across the board here, or I don't know if this team will continue losing 5 out of 6, but they're sure not going to be winning more than they lose, and that really this really has the potential to go sideways very, very quickly as they're facing the Yankees. They're going to be facing Cleveland in the not too distant future. I mean, they're still going to be playing some good teams. Boston's coming up. I mean, it's this thing has the potential to get worse before it gets better if they don't turn it around here very, very quickly.
Start spreading the news. The Orioles are bad in last place, having trouble winning, and off to New York here for a weekend of baseball that looks like, in the beginning of the week, it looked like they weren't going to get these games in. Now it looks like the weather's going to hold up, and they're going to play baseball in 40-degree weather in New York all weekend. So you can find Luke at WNST.net, as well as Baltimore Luke out on Twitter, and you can always find us out at WNST.net for all we're writing, saying, thinking about RG3, the Orioles in New York this weekend, and, of course, Masters duties for everyone out there who loves golf this weekend. Be watching that and opining on that as well. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.